I've worked for Valpak for 7 years now and spent the last 5 of those working on the international environmental compliance team. And as the name suggests, we focus more on assisting companies in identifying and complying with potential obligations in overseas markets. And today I'd just like to take you through a few things to be aware of and some of the things that you may come up against if you are trading overseas. So firstly, could I just get a show of hands for anyone who's already trading overseas or thinking about it? Got businesses in other markets? No? Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully there'll still be plenty for you to take away from it. So first and foremost then, why listen? What is the point of this? Well, as you know, waste is a constant and growing issue. We're very much a throwaway society, unfortunately. People think nothing of replacing their phone every year, replacing their TVs. So it's a real growing issue worldwide. And as a result, engagement from all levels is vital. We need to have not only the consumers involved in recycling, but we need to engage with producers and distributors and all stages of the chain that are contributing to waste. And of course, legislation enables us to do the right thing. That's the bottom line of it. We need to be taking responsibility for the waste that we're producing, particularly if we're thinking about impact on the future. There's also an argument to be had that compliance helps stabilise commodities markets. So to put it very briefly, the incentives provided by producer responsibility tend to keep commodities moving through the waste stream because there's very little incentive to just stockpile these things and wait for the value to go up. And of course, it's also a few things for you to consider prior to going to market, or if you're thinking of expanding into other markets, there should be plenty for you to take away as well. And of course some of the risks that go along with that. So I just wanted to start with a few quick statistics, and I think this is quite powerful. Research shows that 61% of internet users shopped online in 2013. So that's more than 6 in every 10 people online are also shopping online, and that was up 11% on 2008, which is a huge, huge jump. So there's a clear upward trend here. And if you actually have a look at the chart here, what it shows is a country-by-country breakdown within the EU. The blue bars are 2008, the pink is 2013, with the darker one in the middle being EU 28. And as you can see, it's across the board. More and more people are shopping online. So what's the point? Well, what I'm saying is that not only is e-commerce a growing market and providing a lot of new opportunities for new businesses and businesses that are already operational, but combined with the fact that the UK government are intending to try and grow UK exports to 1 trillion by 2020, that's a considerable value. So these kind of compliance issues that we're going to be talking about are going to affect more and more and more companies moving forwards. And the reason it's so important is a concept that's being termed the circular economy. So whereas the traditional linear economy is a case of make, use and waste or dispose of, it really is about trying to reintroduce waste products back into new production. So taking all the bits and pieces that get removed from electrical products, recycling the packaging, keeping these resources in use for as long as possible so that there's less going into landfill. So the directives that we're mainly talking about today, if we're kind of focusing on the EU, are the Packaging Waste Directive, which came in '94, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, or WEEE Directive, that came in 2002, and the Waste Batteries Directive of 2006. And these all introduced what's known as the producer pays principle. So as I've already mentioned, rather than expecting all the costs of waste management and recycling to fall to the consumer, it's actually about engaging with the producers and the manufacturers and such. And these directives have very much been used as a basis for a lot of other countries to actually develop their own regulations. So we're seeing more and more countries worldwide now, more than 50 at the last check, that have similar kind of legislation in place. So I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about different routes to market and how these might affect you and might result in obligations for you. Just wanted to give you a quick overview of where there are these kind of regulations in place currently. So as you'd expect, the EU is very much active with this. The US now, Canada. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's a global issue. This isn't just limited to the EU. So do I need to worry? That's the question we get asked most often. Am I going to be obligated? Is it going to affect me? And really the main issue is for producers. And when we say producers, we mean manufacturers, it could be importers, it could just be anyone placing products onto the market for the first time. So you can be affected regardless of whether you have a physical presence. I think it's quite common for people to think, well, we don't have a company in whichever country, so it's not going to affect us. But actually distance selling is quite a big issue and one which captures many, many companies. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go through. Volume of exports, again, we receive a lot of calls from people saying, well, actually I only do very, very small amounts, maybe even single digits in some cases to certain countries, and they assume therefore that they're not going to be obligated. And actually this is very much not the case. There's very few minimum thresholds in the EU and beyond, and where there are thresholds, they do tend to be rather low. Also, whether you're selling to distributors or end users, it doesn't necessarily matter. Oftentimes people think if they're selling to resellers, the reseller is the importer, therefore I'm not obligated. Again, it doesn't work like that. It can depend on things such as who owns the goods as they enter the country. So these are all things that you'll need to consider when you are looking at new markets. So very quickly, just want to run through some of the common features that you'll come up against when you do look to move into new markets and do start to consider your compliance in other countries. So financial responsibility is always a big issue. As I mentioned before, it's about someone having to take that responsibility for the waste that's being put into the market. And again, it might be the manufacturer, it could be the person who's just first selling it. It does vary. Consumer information requirements, again, this is about engaging with customers, the public, maybe awareness campaigns, certain messages on your packaging. This is something you do see quite commonly from country to country as well. Then the requirement to register with key bodies and authorities. So if you are obligated in whichever country, it's very likely that you'd have to register with a central body, such as the Environment Agency we have in the UK, and perhaps even a compliance scheme. Many countries give you the option to either comply individually, going directly to the authorities, or you can usually do this, again, through a compliance scheme. It tends to be much easier to go through a compliance scheme. They'll usually offset a lot of the administrative burden for you, and they know how to do things more quickly with less hassle. Then the requirement to declare sales data. So again, if you are selling products into these countries, you usually have to tell somebody. So the central body that you're registered with or the compliance scheme, you'd need to report your figures to them. And then ultimately this is all to achieve recycling and recovery targets. Every country in the EU has these targets set out by the directive, and many non-EU countries have also set their own targets. And that's unfortunately where the common features end, because in true EU style, everybody has kind of done their own thing and implemented things a bit differently. So we could talk about the differences all day, but I've just picked out some of the key ones. For example, as we talked about who's obligated, I won't go over it all again, but it very much depends on what you're doing, who you're selling to, where you're selling it, how much of it you're selling. There's no black and white answer for this, so you need to consider each country on its individual merits. Data requirements is a big issue. Again, we often get companies that make the UK submissions and think, well, we've already got our systems ready for this, we'll be fine for declaring overseas. But actually every country has their own data requirements, and this can be everything from a real straightforward 15-20 minute online process to weeks of digging into systems and getting all kinds of different supplier information. It can be very time consuming. And frequency as well is a good point. In the UK, the packaging submission is only once annual, which is enough for the people that have to do it. But many countries will have them quarterly or even monthly in some cases as well. So you need to consider, do you have space in your Outlook diary to take on all these additional deadlines? Costs, again, I won't go into too much detail on it, but you can't really use the UK as an example for your costs in other countries. Again, due to the different socio-economic conditions and the different types of compliance systems introduced, costs vary massively in each country as well. So again, you need to be prepared to look into these individually. Number of compliance schemes, again, in the UK we have quite a large number of schemes for packaging and WEEE and a fair few for batteries compliance. But overseas you tend to see sometimes it's a single government-run monopoly or maybe a tax system, or they might also have an equally large number of schemes. So then you need to consider, well, what's my priority? Is it cost? Is it customer service? Is it how quickly they can turn around my queries? These are all things that you need to have a think about. And then penalties. All we can say on penalties really is that all regulations have provisions for penalties and enforcement. Perhaps fines are quite common. Some of them even talk about prison sentences for extreme cases. So again, it's really worth looking into these things, even if just to confirm that you have no obligations. Just to come back to my point about minimum thresholds. So in the UK for packaging, we have minimum thresholds of 50 tonnes of packaging placed onto the market and £2 million turned over each year. You have to meet these thresholds. So we're actually really providing a cushion for our producers, I guess. For the smaller companies, we're removing much of the burden from them. Unfortunately, this is not the case in most of Europe. So we've taken a few of the key countries that we tend to get queries on and just giving you an example. And everywhere there's a red cross, if you're selling into them, any volumes at all, you potentially have obligations in these countries. As you can see, I think it's quite impactful. Similarly, what we've done is taken the same countries again. On the left-hand side, we've assumed if you're a UK distance seller into any of these countries, so you're selling over the internet, for example, and assuming any thresholds are met, you would have obligations everywhere that you see a green tick. And on the right-hand side, again, if you do have a physical presence in this country and you're importing or placing things onto the market, again, you can have obligations in all these places. So you can very quickly find yourself with a lot of work to do just to comply. Now the green dot is something I just wanted to give a couple of minutes to on its own because it's quite a big issue and it does come up very often. It's originally intended to denote that a financial contribution has been made to packaging waste management at its end of life. So the idea is that the consumer sees the green dot and knows that that packaging has been accounted for. Unfortunately, again, in typical EU style, every country has implemented it differently. So we're now in a situation where if you are selling into every EU country, the green dot symbol is a mandatory legal requirement on consumer sales packaging in a handful of countries. It's voluntary in a number of others, and it's completely unrecognised in some others. But the bottom line message of it is that if you are selling into Europe, there's a good chance you're going to need it on your packaging for some countries, and then in the voluntary countries you're going to need to license it anyway because it's on your packaging. So it really is quite a complex subject. Just to complicate it even further, there's a separate licensing arrangement for the NAFTA region, so Mexico, Canada, USA. They have a whole separate licensing thing there. But again, if you place packaging on the market there showing the symbol, you need to have the license. And again, just a quick point that Valpak licenses it in the UK. So if it is on your packaging, you do need to have a license through Valpak. And I just wanted to give one quick country-specific example. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but just to give you an example that if you were selling to France, let's say you're an online retailer and you deliver to consumers in France. First and foremost, there's no thresholds for packaging, WEEE or batteries. There's none at all. So again, that single sale that you make, let's say it's an MP3 player, you're now obligated for the battery that's in it, the electrical product itself, and the packaging around that MP3 player. So you need to be registered for all of those things. They have one packaging scheme, so that kind of makes the decision a little easier. 2 for WEEE and 2 for batteries. So again, you've not got too much of a decision to make as to who to join. The green dot that we've just discussed is mandatory on B2C sales packaging in France. So again, if you are selling to France and your products are going to consumers, you need to have the green dot on your primary retail packaging. It's not optional. We also talked about data requirements in different countries, and France's detailed form is extremely labour intensive. Without going into too much detail, it requires a line-by-line breakdown of every single piece of packaging around every product that you do, and the form is in an Excel spreadsheet and runs for about 26 different columns of information. It takes a long, long time, and it's very, very intensive, as we say. Thankfully for smaller producers, anyone who places less than 180,000 units on the market in a year, there is a simplified submission which is much more user-friendly, shall we say. You do see that in some other countries as well, it's not just France. Also, if you are selling electrical products, again, if we use the distance selling example, if you're a foreign company selling into France of electrical goods, you need to have what's called an authorized representative, a legally authorized representative to register on your behalf. I'll be coming back to that shortly because it needs a bit more detail. Just wanted to talk again now a bit more specifically about the WEEE Directive itself, because as I mentioned, it came in 2002. So there's been a good decade of kind of statistics about how it's going, what's working, what isn't. And in 2013, the European Parliament back changes to the WEEE Directive. Amongst other things, this laid out more ambitious targets. So again, we really need to get the recycling figures up. They've made it harder to be non-compliant or non-obligated, and what we mean by this is they've closed down some of the inherent loopholes within the previous directive that allowed certain companies to avoid the regulations. The distance selling was always a big issue for that. There's going to be less categories, so at the moment we submit in kind of 10 primary categories and then a couple of subcategories in the UK. Some countries have far more that you have to scope all your products into before declaring them, and again it can be very time consuming, very labour intensive. But under the recast there'll be much less categories, around 6 in most countries, so that should be much better for the producers. And as I mentioned, distance sellers are going to need a legally authorised representative. And what this is an entity in the country that you're selling into that is prepared to be registered on your behalf to take the legal obligations from you. So you'll still be registered and compliant in that country, but they will be your authorised representative. So if there's any need for enforcement action or anything like that, it's the authorised representative that would be pursued by the authorities. As you can imagine, this can be very costly because, well, not many people are going to want to take that responsibility on. But unfortunately, in the countries that have made it mandatory, you cannot comply without one. So it kind of puts the producers in a difficult position, especially if you do low volumes. You know, it's quite common for the cost of an authorised representative to actually exceed the revenue that some companies are making, which is unfortunately a bit of a difficult situation. But as the image shows on the left-hand side, you may be making the sale directly to the end user, but you have to be registered through that legally authorised representative. So again, while the recast overall is a very good thing, and this concept is a great idea, it's not been implemented brilliantly in all countries, so it is some extra administration for you to think of. So, why comply then? A lot of companies come to us and say, well, I'm only doing small volumes, I don't deem it to be very risky, why should I comply in the first place? Well, as we've mentioned, it's to ensure an environmentally friendly approach to waste. It's something, again, that we should all be conscious of and we should all want to contribute to. It's not just about making money, it's about doing it responsibly and in an environmentally friendly way. As I mentioned, there's the risk of prosecution and fines. This, again, is a very real issue. Companies do get prosecuted, companies do get fined for non-compliance, and it's something for you to consider. Brand reputation is, I guess, quite an obvious one. If you are a big brand, if you are a well-known brand, it only needs the wrong tweet to go viral or the wrong newspaper article to really change that overnight, even in some cases. And that, of course, ties into consumer awareness. So again, with the immediacy of social media, consumers are now very savvy with environmental concerns. So it's good for you to be ahead of the curve. In some markets, customers may request evidence of compliance as well. If we use Germany as an example on this one, it's very common for German customers to push back on their UK suppliers and say, we want to see evidence that you're registered and compliant in Germany before we'll buy your products. And as I say, that can actually slow the sale process down for a lot of companies and has actually blocked sales in some cases as well. So it's worth being compliant where you need to be. And then, of course, to stay ahead of your competitors, this is still an issue that is massively overlooked by a lot of companies. People just either don't realise or don't take it seriously enough and just don't consider it a concern. So you can actually use this as a good way to stay ahead of your competitors and kind of expand your green credentials, if you like. So what are the next steps? Again, I'm aware that I've thrown a lot of information at you in a very short amount of time. It's a lot of things to consider. But we tend to say you need to start by looking at the research side of things. So what are our priority countries? Where are we shipping to currently? Where would we like to ship to? You need to start looking into whether your commercial activity is actually going to obligate you for anything. So maybe speak to compliance schemes, Valpak equivalents overseas. You need to speak to authorities. You need to have a dig through the regulations and figure out what's actually going to apply to you. If you do establish that you have got obligations, you would then need to register with the appropriate authority or scheme. One thing I would say about this is you need to allow a lot of time. The registration process, if you're very lucky, can be 15 minutes online, or if you're unlucky, it can actually be a very long, drawn-out process requiring loads of different forms and power of attorneys and a lot of paperwork. So give yourself plenty of time before you go to that market. Calculation of data, again, as I said, you may need to have systems that incorporate things that they haven't previously to capture certain data that you've never needed before. So you need to consider whether you've actually got access to that or whether you're going to need to amend your systems. Once you've calculated the data, and again you've got all these dates in your diary and your Outlook calendar is full of reminders to actually pull this data out, you then need to submit it. So again, you've got deadlines for your submissions, you've got deadlines for when you need to liaise with the schemes and ensure that the people supplying you with the data are doing it on time. So I suppose my take-home message from the whole thing would be, allow yourself plenty of time and take everything on a country-by-country basis. You can't make any assumptions, you can't use the UK as a yardstick for anything, because every country is doing things that little bit differently.